Flaps close.
Ferrari and Lotus have built some of the greatest and most iconic sports cars we've ever seen. But even their Grand Tourers haven't been the kind of cars you'd want to do really long distances in, particularly if you're carrying more than one passenger or lots of luggage.
But now, both companies at the same time have launched cars that promise the driving thrills of a sports car and the practicalities of an SUV.
To measure the success of the Lotus Eletre and the Ferrari Purosangue, we've got a Bentley Bentayga, an out-and-out luxury SUV from a manufacturer that knows a thing or two about making long-distance cruisers and sports cars. So Will, what is that Ferrari that you're in?
It is, Doug, the new Ferrari Purosangue, and in many ways it's classic old school Ferrari because it has a naturally aspirated V12 engine under that long bonnet in front of me. However, it is Ferrari's first four-door car in its 84-year history, or actually 5 doors if you count the hatchback boot. And arguably, as well, it's Ferrari's first SUV, although we're not allowed to call it that. Ferrari has assured me that this is not an SUV, it is in fact an FUV, or Ferrari utility vehicle. So there you go.
And why exactly don't Ferrari want it to be an SUV?
Well, I guess there are some negative connotations about SUVs. They have a reputation for being heavy, tall cars that don't handle very well. And Ferrari has built its reputation on making lightweight sports cars that handle brilliantly.
Okay, interesting. So it's not an SUV, it's a FUV.
It's
instead.
a FUV. It's a new genre of car. It is nothing like your Bentley or that Lotus.
Understood. So the Purosangue represents a manufacturer going in an all-new direction, but still trying to keep as much as possible familiar with what the brand represents. But the same can't be said of your car, can it, Neil?
Yeah, it's probably fair to say that the Eletre shares nothing in common with any Lotus that's ever gone before it. I mean, when you think of Lotus, you think of small sports cars. Lightness is in Lotus's very DNA, and yet here I am sat in a 2.5 ton electric SUV.
And is it really completely different from any other Lotus?
Well, I guess it wears a Lotus badge, and Lotus says that despite it looking like an SUV, it actually drives like a Lotus, but I guess we're going to have to find out if that's the case.
And Will, where are we going?
Well, we are going to drive from London to Wales and back again. So we're going to be finding out what these cars are like to live with on a long motorway journey, but also what they're like to drive on some more challenging roads, because after all of these manufacturers, even Bentley, built their reputation on the racetrack. So Neil, we're on the motorway now, and how is your Lotus?
I'm pretty happy actually. I have to admit, leaving Twickenham, I wasn't overly enamoured with the ride quality through town. It was a bit lumpy and abrupt, but now that we're out on the motorway, it's really settled down. And by and large, this thing is pretty quiet. The only disappointing element is that it does seem to drum up quite a lot of road noise. But how about you? How are you getting on in the Ferrari?
Well, you know what? This is much, much better on the motorway than I thought it would be. So there is way less road noise than you probably imagine. Huge 23-inch wheels on the back, 315 cross-section tyres, and they don't drum up much tyre noise at all, really. And the ride is very good as well. So I've got the Manettino switch in comfort mode, and if you press that down, you can actually put the suspension in its softest setting. I've had it in that pretty much the whole journey, and it's been really smooth.
So actually, it sounds like your Ferrari might be a better long-distance cruiser than my Lotus. I guess what's even more important than how they fare on the motorway is how they perform on a country road. So I guess I'll see you in Wales.
So we've made it to Wales and it's time to find out more about these three cars. So Will, what do we need to know about this Ferrari?
Well, Ferrari insists this is not an SUV. And you know what, compared with a Roma or a 296 GTB, obviously this is quite a tall car, but if you compare it to other normal road cars, it's not actually that big. So I had this parked up next to the latest Mini Countryman a couple of days ago, and that absolutely towered over this. It is quite long though, it's nearly 5 meters long. A lot of that is in this bonnet here, and I think we should have a look what is underneath it. So Doug, if you give me a quick hand.
Right.
There you go, look at that, it's a thing
Wow.
of beauty. It is a 6.5 litre V12, pumps out 715 brake horsepower, and that is fed to all four wheels via a dual clutch gearbox, an 8-speed on the rear axle, and then there's another 2-speed gearbox on the front axle, so a very similar transmission setup than was on the GT4 Lusso. It weighs around about 2 tonnes, it can do 0 to 62 in 3.3 seconds, and it tops out at 193 miles an hour. But it is quite expensive.
Okay, how expensive is this?
£313,000.
£313,000. But this one is a bit more expensive than that, isn't it?
That is true, it does have 1 or 2 options on it. So if you wanted to buy this car, the paint alone adds £20,000 to the price.
20 grand.
It would cost
for red
you
paint.
around about 414,000.
So compared to the Ferrari, that Lotus is an absolute bargain.
I guess you could say that, but the first thing you need to know about this Lotus is it's rather controversial because it's effectively everything a car enthusiast thinks a Lotus shouldn't be. It's heavy, it's electric, and it's an SUV. But 2 of those criticisms could have been levelled at the first generation Porsche Cayenne, and that car is now a well-respected sports SUV and is responsible for keeping that company in rude health. So, if you're a car enthusiast, you should be willing this thing to do well.
But the important point to make there is that the Cayenne was very good.
Yeah, it was good from the off. But the good news is, on paper at least, this is quite promising. So if you go for the standard car or the S like we've got here, those are mechanically identical. They produce just over 600 brake horsepower. They have twin motors, one on the front and one on the rear axle. And that allows it to go from 0 to 62 miles an hour in a claimed 4.5 seconds. But if that's not quick enough for you, there's also an R version, which we've yet to test, which gets a more powerful rear motor, giving it just over 900 brake horsepower and lowering that 0 to 62 mile an hour figure to below 3 seconds, making it quicker than your Ferrari.
Does it have a V12 under there?
It sadly doesn't have a V12 under there. It has space for its charging cable.
And it needs all of that power, doesn't it?
Yeah, it's rather heavy. It weighs fractionally more than your Bentley, but it does have a massive 109 kilowatt hour battery, giving it a pretty impressive 354 mile claim range.
So this is heavier than the Bentley that we've got here, which seems ridiculous because this has got high quality leathers, it's got air suspension, it's got a 4 litre twin turbocharged V8, and it just looks like a tank, doesn't it? And now this sits very naturally in Bentley's lineup, doesn't it? No one bats an eyelid at the Bentayga's existence. But if you remember, almost 10 years ago when this was launched, it was a very controversial car. Like the Purosangue and like the Lotus Eletre as well, it was Bentley's first ever SUV. The styling wasn't exactly a hit with everyone, but it's gone on to be a massive success for Bentley. They've been having lots of sales success recently. The Bentayga accounts for almost half of everything that they sell. And we've driven this car loads. It had a facelift in 2020. It's always been very good and very impressive. If you buy one today, you can have a 4 litre V8, which is the model that we've got here. It's got almost 550 brake horsepower. It can do 0 to 62 miles an hour in 4.5 seconds. There's also a plug-in hybrid V6. There used to be a diesel V8 and there used to be a 6 litre W12, but they've both been discontinued. And we've driven this car lots. It's not new in this test. We know that it's very, very good. And on paper, it looks like it could be the ultimate SUV, even compared to these two.
Should we go for a drive and find out?
Let's do that.
Well, this is a bit of a change from that motorway leg, isn't it? And I'll tell you what, this Ferrari is a completely different beast on a road like this when you put the driving mode in its most aggressive setting. That puts the suspension in what Ferrari describes as its hardest mode, and the suspension deserves a special mention actually, because it's a really clever system with an electric motor in each of the dampers. And when you turn into a corner, the ones on the outside effectively prop the car up to reduce body roll. Now, of course, there is still a very small amount of lean, but Ferrari has hinted on a lighter car, and with a different tuning of the suspension, there's no technical reason why it couldn't effectively tip the car into the corner to seemingly defy physics. The steering is quick, it's direct, it's beautifully weighted. The only thing I would say is that the Purosangue does prefer smooth tarmac and quite wide corners. It's dealing with these narrow, often poorly surface mounted roads remarkably well, and I've no doubt much better than the other two SUVs we've got here. But when you hit some bigger bumps and compressions, as we have done along this route, you do start to realise that this is not a lightweight mid-engine sports car, it is a 2-ton SUV. Sorry, FUV. Anyway, one thing utterly dominates the driving experience of this car, and that is the V12 engine. It is a work of art, and I would argue that other than perhaps the Ferrari badge, it is the biggest appeal of this car. Now, it might seem a ridiculous thing to say about an engine with more than 700 brake horsepower, but acceleration isn't so brutal, so savage, that you can't use it on the road. And I would say that in the SF90 and the 296 GTB, they're both plug-in hybrids, they have so much pull at low revs that you can't really use their acceleration properly unless you're on a racetrack. Whereas in here, you can change down a couple of gears, let the engine rev out, and really enjoy that. And I promise you, you won't be able to resist doing it because it sounds absolutely glorious.
Sadly, I don't have a V12 soundtrack. In fact, I don't have any soundtrack at all. And that makes accelerating in this thing feel a little uneventful, as does the fact that it doesn't feel that quick off the line. And I reckon that's because this is either torque limited or because it has a 1-speed gearbox that has to take it all the way from 0 to 160 miles an hour. But if you go for the R model, you not only get a load more power, but you also get a 2-speed gearbox, and that drops the 0 to 62 mile an hour time below 3 seconds. However, once you get up to speed in this car, and I'm talking 30, 40, 50, 60 miles an hour, because the electric motors respond instantly to any throttle input, the overtaking performance or roll-on performance in this thing is very impressive. And that's allowed me to keep up with the Ferrari and Bentley today on these country roads. What's slightly less impressive is this car's handling. Now, that's not to say it's a poor handling car, far from it. In fact, it grips really hard in the corners thanks to its wide, sticky tyres, and body control is excellent. It stays very settled even through quick changes of direction. However, when you really start pushing on, you find that this thing starts to push wide at the front first. And in a sports car, that wouldn't be a problem because you could just lift off the accelerator gently mid-corner to adjust your line, or you could give it a boot full of throttle and help tease the rear end round into oversteer to help give you a better corner exit, or just to have a bit of fun. Sadly, if you do either of those things in this car, you'll just find that it pushes wide at the front even more, which means it's a very safe and neutral setup, but rather dull. And I think that's a problem because Lotus says that this looks like an SUV, but drives like a Lotus. But I can't remember driving an Elise or an Emira or an Exige that was so bland in the bends. And I think that is an issue when you're hanging your heritage off your very first sports SUV.
This looks like a Bentley and it drives like a Bentley. So that means it's incredibly comfortable, it's amazingly quiet, it's very, very powerful as well. This is the V8S, and compared to the regular versions of the Bentayga, this has retuned suspension, it's got different steering as well, it's got a sports exhaust, which sounds absolutely hilarious. And to be honest, this is the Bentayga at its best. Because not only is it still very, very comfortable and refined, but it also has more of a sporty edge than a regular car. Now, this isn't a new version of the Bentley, we know this already, but it really, really is impressive and surprising how good this is to drive on twisty roads. Because remember, this is a near 2.5 ton SUV, but the way it resists body lean through corners is pretty remarkable. But let's be real, the major strength of this car is obviously its long distance cruising manners. What a fantastic day. 3 great cars, loads of driving. We have got quite a long journey back to the hotel now though, haven't we?
Well, that's fine. I've still got half a tank of fuel.
I've got more than half a tank actually. What about you, Neil?
Yeah, that might be a problem for me. As we're sat here, that thing is losing energy and it's just dropped down to 23%.
Ooh, 23% in the Lotus. How many miles is that worth?
About 70.
You might.
It's 60 miles
Yeah,
until
you
the
might
hotel.
just
That's
make it.
absolutely fine.
I'm not worried.
Let's go.
All right. Oh, this is lovely weather.
What a gorgeous day. Hang on, where's your car?
Actually, mine's around the back because it's been on charge.
So you made it here last night?
With 1% remaining,
1%.
which wasn't anxiety-inducing at
No, I
all.
bet it must have been a very relaxing journey
Very
here.
relaxed.
And then you stuck it on charge?
Yeah, last night.
How long did it have to charge for?
Quite a few hours.
Okay, so it's on full now?
It's on full now, so I'm ready to go, but it did cost me £94.
Ouch. And you charged once to get to Wales yesterday.
Yeah, had to charge twice yesterday.
Wow.
Okay. Well, that's a lot of money, but I'm not going to laugh yet because I haven't filled up the Ferrari and I've no idea how much that's going to cost.
And you're
Well,
the same, right?
I'm the same, but I've still got half a tank, so I can probably make it back.
Okay, well, I'm fully charged and I don't have to go to the petrol station.
Perfect, yeah.
So I'll see you at the driving roads.
Let's get
go.
out this rain.
Let's take a closer look at these interiors now, and we will start with the Bentley because I bet the luxury that is on offer here is far superior to what you experience in the Ferrari and the Lotus.
I've got to admit, that is true.
It does feel very well screwed together in here.
Everything up here is great. You've got incredibly high quality materials. The build quality is outstanding. Look at all these buttons here. They're very easy to reach, very easy to use. And not only that, but they're very satisfying to use because of the exceptional quality in each button. And the layout of everything's brilliant. The driving position as well, very, very good. Loads of adjustment. Fantastic, fully digital driver display, which is very easily customizable, very easy to see. And an infotainment system that I also reckon is probably better than what you two have because it's very responsive, very nice graphics. The only thing, on some menus, it would be better if the font and the icons could be a little bit bigger. But that's pretty much the only negative I can think. Plus, on top of all this, I've got one of the best sound systems on any car ever. It's the upgraded Name 20 speaker setup.
It is one of the very best systems on any car.
Yeah, I agree. It's the best system I think I've ever heard on a production car.
So I don't really have anything to complain about up here, and I bet you're also quite comfortable in the back.
So what is this arrangement we've got in the back here?
Well, you might have noticed it's 4 seats instead of 5, which is great. And you get massaging seats, you get electrically adjustable seats, you get lumbar support. It's fantastic.
But you can have 5 seats.
You can have 5. You get 5 seats as standard.
But does it cost you more?
But a little bit, yeah. If you want one less seat than you get as standard, it is more than £10,000.
Okay.
But how comfortable is it back there?
Very comfortable. Lots of legroom, certainly.
Yeah.
Foot space as well. The only thing I would say is that although these headrests are very soft, you've got pillows on them, if I do sit back, then my head hits the roof. Now, this is probably partly to do with that panoramic sunroof, but at least I can sort of slouch a little bit and it's not so much of an issue.
Okay.
I've also got massaging function, or both of us have rather, this small panel in the back there.
Indeed.
That can be removed and I can
Look at
sit
the back
here.
of it.
Nice knurling.
Quality.
Attention to detail
Beautiful.
there.
Yeah.
And activate massaging seats.
And because you need to put your seat back, you can also save that, can't you? Because we've got memory function in the back as well.
We do.
However, I actually think that my Lotus, quite surprisingly, has more space in the back. Certainly more headroom than this.
More space?
More space.
Should we take a look?
Yeah, let's have a look.
Let's see.
You know what, Neil? You're right. There is actually more space in the back here than there was in the Bentley.
Yeah, I mean, this thing is as long as the Bentley, so that doesn't surprise me massively. You do look like you've got quite a lot of room there. A lot of legroom and most noticeably, yeah.
And this does have a glass roof as well. This is a 5-seat configuration though, isn't it?
Yeah, like Doug's Bentley, you can specify 4 seats and it will only cost you £5,000.
Now, Will, you might have a little bit more room back there, but do you feel anywhere near as comfortable as you do in the Bentley?
I've got to be honest, these seats, they are not as comfortable. And the headrest as well, that is pretty firm. So I wouldn't mind doing a long journey in the back here, but certainly wouldn't be as comfortable as I was in the Bentley.
To be fair, this is half the cost of the Bentayga, isn't it?
It is half the cost of the Bentayga.
Does it feel like half the cost up front?
I wouldn't say so. I think it's actually better than that. I think it gets quite close to the Bentley in terms of kind of fit and finish. I think this one looks pretty decent. The only thing I would say is it's tried to copy the Bentley in certain areas, like with this knurling, but instead of it being metal, it's plastic.
It's also just not very nicely finished.
Yeah, I think the whole point of knurling is that it feels nice, and yet this one is a little bit unpleasant. But everything else is quite nice. I like the contrast stitching. You've got carbon fibre inserts here, and all this Alcantara feels and looks very nice. Sporty. It also has a massive OLED touchscreen display.
Sure, this is much bigger than the one that you get in the Bentley.
I have a much bigger screen than yours, and I think it's actually a little bit quicker to react as well. This is your home screen, so you can see how much charge you've got.
That looks cool, but it's just pointless, isn't it?
It's kind of pointless. I think it is really something to show off to your friends. You can use it to unlock the charging port, open the boot, you know, put the wing up to show off, but really, yeah.
It's a bit Tesla, isn't it?
It's a bit Tesla, and it's there to look cool.
But the system itself?
The system itself is very good. Yeah, you've got a shortcut here that brings up all your apps, and when you want to dive into the settings, it's all pretty intuitive, I have to admit.
And look, I've got a screen over here as well.
What is that, Doug? What is the purpose of that?
Well, it's very, very thin, and it's showing me what we're listening to. And that's about it. What I can do is pause what we're listening to, play again. I can skip track, but that's it. And it seems a little bit ridiculous because I can do exactly the same thing down here, and that's actually closer and more convenient than using this screen.
But could you not kick back, put your feet up on that dashboard?
Well, that is a good point. I probably could do that.
It?
Yeah, I could just take my shoes off.
I just wouldn't want to be in the car while you're doing that. Okay. But again, mirrored over here, I have a very similar setup for all of my driving information, which I find very useful.
It's not too thin, you can see everything?
No, you can see everything. It's maybe a little redundant seeing that you also have a head-up display as standard, but the more information I have, the better.
Okay, great. Now, in the back, obviously it's very practical in terms of the actual space that you have, but it's also very easy to get in and out of, like the Bentley as well.
Yeah, you've got really big doors here, so it is very easy for me to get out.
Is that the same in the Ferrari, Will?
It's a little bit more complicated, and it's probably best I show you.
Okay, let's have a look.
Okay, so as I said yesterday, first Ferrari with rear doors, but opening them is a little bit different than it is on a lot of cars, because you've got this little handle here, and if I pull that and hold it down, then...
Oh, wow.
Opens electrically.
Like
rear
a Rolls-Royce?
hinged,
Like a Rolls-Royce.
suicide door arrangement. You've got to be a little bit careful not to bang your shin on that bit of carbon fibre there. I've done that a couple of times, and it is quite painful.
But I guess having the door open that way makes it easier to get in.
Well, why don't you find out?
All right, well, I'll have a go. Okay, so yeah, you can kind of just sit straight in quite easily.
If you want to close the door, there's a little button there for you, Neil.
Oh, very posh.
Wow.
So, Neil, how are you in the back?
Well, there's definitely more room in here than Ferrari's last four-seater, the GTC4 Lusso, but compared to the cars that we've got with us today, it's a bit more cramped. These side windows are quite short, which makes it feel a little claustrophobic, and if I try and put my head back, I can't even touch the headrest. I'm straight onto the roof, and I'm quite a lot shorter than you. But I do have enough leg room, which means I can kind of slouch down. So a fairly long journey would be okay in the back of here. I'm not entirely sure I'd want to go all the way to the Alps on a ski trip, but it would be doable.
Kids would be fine back there.
Oh yeah, I think as a family car, this would be absolutely acceptable.
But far more important is the driving position. This is a Ferrari, of course, and of course you sit higher up than you do in other Ferraris like the 296 and the Roma, but compared with the other SUVs here, I'd say you actually feel quite low down in the car.
Yeah, certainly.
And I think that's not a bad thing. This is a Ferrari after all. Driving position fundamentally very good. Seats are supportive. Perhaps a little bit more support on the side bolsters. That's the only minor complaint I'd have. But this steering wheel isn't actually standard. So this is a carbon fibre steering wheel with LED shift lights at the top. And if I want that, it will cost me £3,083.
For a steering wheel.
For a steering wheel. And if I want it heated, first time you can have a heated steering wheel on a Ferrari, that will cost me an extra £770. But really we're talking about small change compared with some of the options in here. So this little bit of carbon fibre up here around the instrument panel, that is £5,136.
So that's more money than the steering wheel?
Yes.
Okay.
Also, this little bit of carbon fibre here, that costs £3,083 as well. This car also has massaging and ventilated front seats. That is another option. I won't find out how much that is because it's too complicated and it's going to mess with my mind too much. But they're very good actually. So to activate them, you have to press this fiddly touch panel here, then choose the massaging setting, and then press this little icon there. This dial comes out of the dashboard, and then I can twist it and turn up or turn down the level of the massaging, and feel that.
That does sound very expensive.
Yeah, but that's a bit ridiculous, isn't it?
But it's not all good, because the infotainment system in this car is frankly terrible. So Ferrari wants to have the infotainment screen behind the steering wheel, and I understand that it wants everything to be driver focused, but other manufacturers have done that. Audi, for example, we've seen that with the TT and the R8. They've had the infotainment screen behind the steering wheel, but they've had a rotary controller between the front seats, so it's not too distracting to use while you're driving. Ferrari has gone for these little touch-sensitive panels on the steering wheel, and they're really fiddly, really complicated to use. Sometimes they don't work properly and need waking up again, and other times they don't quite do what you want them to do. So really, I would rather they just use proper buttons, or actually, and I never thought I'd say this, but just a touchscreen, it would be better than this. The good news is though, I don't have to do all of the infotainment system controlling because...
Well look, I've got a touchscreen here where I can control things like the media. I can see how quickly we're going, and this screen is rather complicated, to be honest. I'd probably have to spend a very long journey working out how to use it effectively.
But at least you won't be trying to drive the car at the same time while using fiddly touch.
That is true,
And it's quite a lot bigger than the one in the Lotus.
Also true. And what about the quality in here? This is more than £400,000 as tested. Does it feel like that in here?
I'm not sure people will be buying a Ferrari expecting Rolls-Royce, Bentley interior materials. A lot of this, as I say, is carbon fibre, which inherently is going to be hard. I would say probably on a par with the Lotus. What do you think?
It's closer to the Lotus than it is to the Bentley, which is way ahead of both of these cars.
Agree with that.
Say that.
Let's take a closer look at these boots now, and we'll start with the Bentley, where you can see I have managed to fit 8 carry-on size suitcases into the back.
Impressive.
Pretty decent.
So it's very, very good for rear seat space, and I suspect this will also be very good in the boot compared to the 2 cars that you have. Plus you can see it's 8 very comfortably, lots of space in the front.
You've got loads of room if you want to put some soft luggage in there.
There's underfloor storage as well if you want it.
And this is the 4-seat version, isn't it?
Correct, which actually gets quite a lot less boot space than the 5-seat version, but it is still very practical, as you can see. But is it much better than the Lotus?
Well, let's find out.
So you've got 8 in there already?
8 in already, and as you can see, I don't have to worry about trying to fit in soft bags. I think there's enough room for an extra couple of suitcases. So
that's 9.
9.
And
10.
10. But will it shut?
will the boot close?
10.
Wow.
Easy.
No problem. Wow, 2 more than we could get in the back of the Bentley.
Yeah. Although, of course, this is the 5-seat configuration.
And this is the 4-seat.
Yeah,
Bentley.
and I think it would be a similar case if you went for the 4 seats in this, because it almost gets its own kind of firewall between the seats and the boot. But pretty impressive.
So 8, 10, 12 in the Ferrari?
That might be a struggle. Well, we have some cases in there already,
Okay.
as you can see.
Okay, I can see 4.
4, there are 4 in there. I've
Okay.
played around with lots of different configurations, bit of a Tetris, but I have worked out the maximum number you can fit in there, under the parcel shelf, of course, which is the rule, is 5.
Okay, and the boot's going to close?
I'm confident that it will.
Okay. Dramatic pause.
There you go.
5.
5
Okay.
places.
50% less bags than you can get in my Lotus.
That is true, although a lot for a Ferrari. And to be honest, if I could spend £414,000 on this car, then I'd probably take the essentials and get the rest flown out.
Good point. But comfortably the least practical car here.
Yes, comfortably the fastest.
Okay, sure. Right, let's go.
So I know I've been gloating about how much fuel I have left, at least compared to Neil in his electric SUV, but I am getting pretty low now. So I've done 273 miles on this tank. The car's gone from telling me I had about 30 odd miles remaining range to 0. How much does it cost to fill the fuel tank of a Ferrari Purosangue? Let's find out. So there you have it, more than £150.
So, surprise, surprise, it is rather expensive filling up a Ferrari, but Will, how expensive is it and how much fuel did you need?
Well, that was one of 2 fill-ups because we topped the tank up at the end of the trip. So in total, I put 150 litres into that tank. And that cost me, because I needed to use premium unleaded, which is obviously more expensive than regular, £267.83.
That's expensive. And we did about 428 miles on the trip, didn't we? So that means that your fuel efficiency was?
It wasn't brilliant. So the Purosangue averaged just under 13 mpg.
Oh, that's painful.
That is bad, let's be honest. But it's only supposed to do 16.5 mpg. And I think anyone who's spending £400,000 or thereabouts on a performance SUV is not going to care at all.
And it's worth it for that V12 soundtrack.
It is a brilliant engine.
Okay, so good point on running costs, and it's probably the same for the Bentley as well, which is lucky because it's also not particularly efficient. I needed a lot less fuel than you, 98.55 litres in total, and it cost me £175.40 in total. And it meant that my average fuel economy for the trip was 19.7 miles per gallon.
Wow, that is frugal.
Which is frugal compared to a Ferrari, but pretty terrible compared to anything else. But surely in this test, the electric car is way cheaper than the other 2 that we had here. Is that right?
Well, you might think that, but that's not the case. So on our road trip, it averaged 2.07 miles per kilowatt hour, which is probably worse than any other electric car we've ever tested. Although I should point out I was driving quite spiritedly at certain points on our trip.
Yeah, I think we all were.
You can say that of all the cars, which is why the fuel economy is not particularly impressive.
Yeah, and that actually means that instead of doing 354 miles of claim range, it would only do 226. So that's what you can expect if you drive the car pretty quickly. But it also means that it's very expensive to fill up because it has a 109 kilowatt hour battery, and I had to stop to charge 3 times. So I put a total of 239 kilowatt hours into the car at a total cost of £188.84.
So that's more expensive than the Bentley.
That is more expensive than the Bentley.
And also you had the inconvenience of finding a charging stop and waiting there for 20 minutes, 30 minutes.
I mean, that's a good point to make, right? You're buying a luxury SUV. I don't think waiting around in a car park is a particularly luxurious experience. And while your fuel tank is, granted, 100 litres, it's still only going to take about 5 minutes for you to recharge or re-energize. So yeah, very expensive. But again, I should point out, I was driving quite quickly and I was charging on the public network.
And so what were you paying per kilowatt hour?
An average of 79p a kilowatt hour.
That's very expensive, isn't it? But actually, that's the cost of it.
Those were the charges that were on the route. So that is what it would cost you. Now, granted, you could do it for cheaper if you charged the car at home. And in fact, if you charged the car at home all the time, it'd be way cheaper than your 2 cars. I did a calculation that if I'd done my final charge at home, it would have cost me in total around about £135 versus 188.
Okay, so then it is cheaper than the Bentley, but
Yeah.
still, I'm sure people will be very surprised at just how expensive that was, doing that journey in an electric car.
Yeah, I think the days of buying an electric car because it's a cheap way to get from A to B is not necessarily true. Of course, if you use it as a company car, and we actually met someone who'd bought an electric as a company car for their company on this trip, then yeah, benefit and kind tax, very competitive. But if you're buying it privately and you're going to do big road trips, it's not as cheap as you might think.
Sure, okay, but as we mentioned earlier, if you're buying one of these three cars, you're probably not that interested in the running costs because you're probably very wealthy and you can probably afford whatever it's going to end up costing. So if we put that to one side, can we pick a winner between these three?
Well, I think that's going to be tricky, but I would say it's probably not the Lotus.
Yeah, I think picking a winner is tricky, but picking a loser is sadly, I think, quite easy, because that's not to say the Lotus is a bad car. Its bones are good, you know, it's got a very nice interior, it's just as practical in the back as the Bentley, and it's got the biggest boot of the three. So in that respect, that's great. And it's quite competitively priced for something that has, I think, the visual kind of gravitas or appeal of something like a Urus. The problem is Lotus is marketing this car as a Lotus. You know, their slogan is for the drivers. And on their website, when you go to spec your Eletre, they say, yes, it looks like an SUV, but it drives like a Lotus. But I think, as we've all found, that's just not true. You know, it's not that interactive in the corners. It's not particularly exciting under acceleration. It's not the quickest to burst away from the line. And even if you are used to driving sports cars, it just kind of feels inert and pretty dull. And I wouldn't be able to say that about any other Lotus I've driven previously. So when you're hanging the heritage of a brand off your brand new electric SUV, that doesn't sit quite right with me. And it's certainly quite a bit behind both of your cars when it comes to just driver appeal.
I'd agree.
Okay, so if that's the case then, can we pick an outright winner between the Ferrari and the Bentley?
I'm not sure we can, because they are very different takes on a performance or luxury SUV. In fact, you could argue that the Purosangue's closest rival is the Lamborghini Urus. We did actually try to get hold of a Urus for this test. Lamborghini told us that it wouldn't be supplying a car because it's a completely different thing. So make of that what you will. But the reality is that people are going to be cross-shopping a Purosangue with maybe a Urus, perhaps even a Rolls-Royce Cullinan, an Aston DBX 707, or a Bentley Bentayga. The thing is, though, is that the Ferrari, although it is higher riding and you can argue maybe an SUV, it's about performance, it's about handling. It does long distance and comfort and practicality surprisingly well for a Ferrari, but its main strengths are its performance and handling, whereas I think the Bentley is quite different.
Well, the Bentley's the opposite, isn't it? Where it does have major strengths in terms of long distance cruising, in terms of its incredibly luxurious interior, it's very practical as well, and it also happens to be surprisingly good when it comes to performance and handling, but those aren't its main strengths. So really, it does kind of depend what your priorities are when you're looking at these two cars. But what is clear is that there isn't an electric SUV around right now that comes close to offering the luxury or the thrills on offer from the very best fuel-powered SUVs out there. So, thank you very much for watching this video. If you want to see another one, click up there. And if you want a great deal on your next car, go to whatcar.com by clicking